In this tutorial, we'll be looking at the formula for average, difference, the 1904 versus 1900 date system, the formula for sum, conditional formatting, and variations of the if-error function. We'll be using recordings from a practice run weekly over a number of weeks. In this case, it was 3 by 500 meters. The values are in the format of minutes, seconds, and tenths of a second, a common format to record 500-meter rowing splits. Note, the process and formulas can be applied to any situation when comparing numbers. Here we can see my athletes are listed down column B, and I have my 3 by 500 meters for each of my weekly practices. Now, when I have just these numbers, it'd be great if I could calculate what the average was. This allows me to give feedback to the athletes so they can see what kind of pace they should be doing to keep them more or less the same and not be all over the map, where we can see Brian has gone up by almost 4 splits or 5 splits every single piece in the first week. To do that, I'm going to insert a column after each practice. I'm going to calculate the average of their pieces. The formula for average is equals average and then the range. Average is used to calculate the average set of numbers or cells in question. For example, equals average of the values in cells B2 to B20, so down a single column, or down a column and across multiple rows, where we can imagine it goes from B2 in the top left corner to E15 in the top right. Now I'm going to insert my formula, equals average, I can highlight my range of cells, close the bracket. I always have to close the exact number of brackets that I've opened. In this case, it's just 1. Hit enter, and my average of these 3 pieces is 147.2. As we saw before, if I'd like to apply this same formula relative to the same cells, I can click to the bottom right-hand corner and drag it down the column. I'm going to do this for the other ones as well. Equals average and drag it down the column, and equals average of these 3 values, close the bracket, and drag it down the column. Now that we can see what their average is after each practice, we want to compare what they are from week to week. I'd like to know in an instant if Justin's average was faster or slower than the week before, and by how much. So again, we're going to insert a column. We're going to call this simply our plus minus. Now, when I inserted the values plus and minus, I had to do a space first, otherwise it's going to want a formula. If I didn't have a space, an error message will appear. So to remove that error, hit space, enter, and we're good to go. So to calculate the difference between 2 cells, I can put in my formula equals cell A minus cell B. Here's an example. B3 minus B2, or G4 minus D4, whichever cells we need to use. So in our case, I'd like to subtract F4 from J4, so I'm going to write equals J4, which is this cell right here, minus, and instead of typing in F4, I can just click on the cell and it will automatically appear in my formula and hit enter. I was to drag this down across, we notice that 2 of the 3 cells have hashtags going across, while the other cell appears normal. If we have a closer look, we can see the average went down, so we have a negative value for Justin. For Tom, he went from 119.5 to 120.2, which was a positive value, and Brian went from 2 minutes to 156, again a negative value. It appears as though the 2 negative values aren't liked by this system. In order to fix this, we need to use the 1904 date system instead of the 1900 date system. The difference between the two systems is based on the compatibility to different operating systems. Each date is seen as a number, and the number for a particular date will be different by 4 years and 1 day between the two options. The 1 day is because there is no leap year in 1900. This is because the 1900 system sees dates and times as numbers, where a day equals a full 1.0, an hour is 1/24th of a day, or 0.04166, etc., and doesn't like negative values. To see time as negative, the spreadsheet needs to be in the 1904 system. To change the date system, go to the Excel, Preferences, click on Calculation, and here we can check the 1904 date system. Aha! Our numbers have appeared, both positive and negatively. Why does this happen? Honestly, I'm not exactly sure, but this was a solution I discovered online. When using Excel, don't be afraid to search online for answers to error messages or ideas you may have. So I'm going to apply this same formula to get the plus minus between the second and third practice. Space plus minus equals my average of my third session minus my average of my second session. I hit enter, and I can of course drag this formula down to as many athletes as I have. Now let's say I want to look at the total change over the 3 weeks. I'm going to insert another column and call this total change over 3 weeks. We can see that this expands over the width of the column, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge it with this column right here by clicking merge and have it wrap to fit. It still doesn't fit, so I can extend this over a little bit, and now I can see my total change over 3 weeks. To calculate it, I'm going to get the sum of each of my plus minus entries. So when we want to add up cells, we use the sum formula. There's multiple variations of this formula. Firstly, we can add consecutive cells individually by typing in equals sum and typing in the cells or clicking on the cells. Or we can write sum with a comma in between each cell. If we want to go a little bit faster, we can add consecutive cells as a group, where we list the first and last cells, and we can do this for one column or multiple columns, or one row or multiple rows. So here, the first example is going across the row, where it's adding up cells A1 to D1, and the second example, you're adding from the top left corner A1 to all the cells to the bottom right hand corner D8. In our document, we're going to add in the sum formula equals sum K4 plus P4, close the bracket, enter, and I'm going to drag the formula down. So here, my average over the course of 3 weeks for Justin has decreased by 7.4 seconds, Adam by 1.9 seconds, and for Brian by 5.5 seconds, where he went from an average of 2-minute splits to 154.5. While these numbers are great, the more numbers there are, the more likely they will blend in. It's going to be difficult to read for any athletes and for coaches alike, and we won't be able to find this information very useful. The negative values in the plus minus columns, wherever they are, I can barely find them, are difficult to see. Solution: we're going to add color to these results with a feature called conditional formatting. Conditional formatting will change the color of the cell based on a rule or set of rules being applied to it. This allows the user to quickly see numbers that are out of a normal range, high or low, or meet a certain criteria. When set in the rules, formulas can even be applied. There's infinite ways to use conditional formatting. The best way to see it, how it works, is to test it out. In our case, we're looking for a positive change where the athlete was slower, such as we had Adam went slower from 119.5 to 120.5, and we have a positive change, which is not a good thing in our sport, or negative changes that we have all around here, which means the athletes went faster, or the possibility of having no change at all from week to week. To apply conditional formatting, we're going to highlight all the cells in that column that have the plus minus, and I'm going to go under conditional formatting, and I'm going to go to highlight cell rules, and I'm going to select, in this case, start off with greater than. For us, it's simply greater than 0. If the cell is greater than 0, then the cell is going to be, I can choose from these options or make a custom version, but I'm going to say light red fill with dark red text. I'm using red as bad for positive numbers because that means they went slower. I click OK, and we can see Adam's first plus minus value went red because it is positive. I can add a second rule. If it's less than 0, now if the cell value is less than 0, instead of filling it with red, I'm going to fill it with green for good, and click OK. While we're here, just in case, I'm going to add another conditional formatting where the cell is equal to 0. So the cell is equal to 0. Instead of being red or green, I'm just going to make it yellow. In this case, nothing was equal, so nothing has changed. I'm going to do the same for these values here. Conditional formatting. Before we move on, I'm going to clean up the sheet a little bit, where I'm going to merge these columns together. Presentation can be very important, makes it easier for the reader to read. There we go. So far, my formulas for this column, for the averages, they're all the same. Right, there we have it. Looks a little bit nicer, a little bit easier to read. I could have also made this also one color so we can see really easily the different practices. Now, let's say I'd like to add another practice. I'm going to, instead of just copying these cells, I'm just going to copy the columns. I'm going to hit Command Copy, and then I'm going to click on Q, right click. I'm going to insert my copied cells. And here's my new values. Okay, in order to see it all on one page, I'm going to make these a little bit smaller, all these columns. Now we can see all 4 practices on one page. So now we can type in our new data. I'm just going to put in some predetermined numbers that I had. And here we can see my average because I copied and inserted this columns to the right. My average, I should double check, Q4 to S4, Q4 to S4, and likewise Q5, S5, and Q6, S6. My plus minus is comparing T4 minus O4, that's exactly what we'd like, and our conditional formatting has automatically occurred. And here in our 3-week total, this has not changed, it has only compared the first 3 weeks. We're going to add in the 4th week, hit enter, and then of course we're going to drag the cell down, and we're going to call this over 4 weeks. So now our formula for the sum of the 3 weeks or 4 weeks, there's a sum of our 4-week total. So far this is reasonably straightforward. Even if Brian were to start a session but not complete the 3rd piece, so if he didn't complete this piece and we would just say that he had to go to the doctor, our average changes but nothing else is affected by it, and we still get everything else changing relative to the previous cells. Now, to illustrate the challenges when various situations, if Brian were to miss one or part of different practices, let's just see what would happen. So I'm going to copy this entire thing, paste it down here. I'm going to copy Brian, paste him a few times. Now, instead of saying doctor, we're going to go back to his original score, 205.7. And I'm going to copy that in each of these, just so that our numbers are nice and consistent. Now I'm going to delete scores for the first practice in our first scenario. So Brian was away for the first practice. We already see an error happening with our average and with our plus minus and with our total change over the 4 weeks. What happens if he misses the second practice? Again, we've got similar issues. The third practice, the fourth practice, or for heaven's sake, 2 practices in a row. That's a lot of errors. If we think about our formulas, our average is concerned with our 3 values right here. The next error message that we have in this row is with the plus minus that compares one average to the other. So because this formula is dependent on this one, let's start with original formula that everything is based off of. To solve for this, we're going to use the if-error function. With the if-error function, the formula is if-error bracket value, comma, value if error. We use this function when we see following errors: hashtag NA, hashtag value, etc., etc. In the formula, value represents the reference or formula or expression to check for an error. And the value if error means the value to return if an error is found. So for instance, if our formula is set if error bracket A1 divided by B1, if an error were to occur when we put that kind of calculation in, then it will, instead of saying error message, it will say please enter a value in B1. B1, of course, because it's the denominator. If we don't have a value in the denominator, we cannot have a value at all. Basically, whatever is written between the quotation marks is what's going to appear in the cell. If we don't want to write a specific message when an error occurs, we have a few options. For example, if A1 showed an error message instead of a number, we can have if error with the formula B1 minus A1. Here's our quotation marks. We have nothing in between, so it just means it would show up as a blank cell called a null string. We could also make a 0 appear, where it just show up as 0. Or if we didn't put quotation marks, it recognizes it as a timed cell. It would show up as in the same format as our other times, with minutes, seconds, and tenths of a second, as 0.00.0. Depending on our situation, you're going to choose which one to use, but most likely the first and last options are the best. Looking at our formula right here, in F15, I'm going to type in the formula equals if error bracket, and we can see it's asking for the value, comma, value if error. I'm going to say if my average of these three values produces an error message, I'm just going to make it a blank cell. I close the brackets, I double check, I've got 1, 2 open brackets, 1, 2 closing brackets, hit enter, and I end up with a blank cell. One error message down, many more to go. Let's look at the plus minus column. Again, I'm going to have a formula equals if error bracket my average subtracted from the previous week's average creates an error. Then again, I'm going to make it a blank cell. So my average appears to be worked, my plus minus appears to work, but if I look over here, my total change over the 4 weeks, there's still an error. So if I put in a 0, we've got a blank average, 0 for my plus minus, and my total change over the 4 weeks also works. Let's try the third option as well, where I don't have the double quotation marks. And now my plus minus appears in a time format with minutes, seconds, and tenths of a second, and I have no effect on my total change over the 4 weeks. They both seem to work, so let's keep it like this, because then our yellow formatting appears quite nicely, and that stands out and reminds us that Brian missed a practice earlier as well. For the average cell, If we were to change it to the 0 and enter, we can see we didn't get an error message. However, our average of 156 minus 0 gives us a positive score of 1:56, and it has a real effect on our total change over the week. If we had just as zeros, again, it's going to have a hugely negative effect because it sees it as 0, and it's going to change our total for the 4 weeks as well. So let's just keep it blank with the double quotation marks. Now that we know that this is our best option, we're going to drag it across, and now each of our formulas is the if-error function. So now if Adam were to miss a practice, this set wouldn't be affected, and we have to drag this formula across as well. It's going to put Adam's scores back in. So there we go with our plus minus. That's worked so far. With my average formula, I'm going to apply it to each of these columns. Equals if error average of these three in a blank cell. I forgot a parenthesis. There we go. Everything's working out quite well. With all of my averages, I've got blanks. I've dragged my formula across all the cells. And now I look back, I have to adjust our plus minus here. Again, I'm going to have equals if error, this cell minus this cell. It's going to equal 0 if there's an error. So if I look back here, and here when Brian missed the first practice, there's nothing for it to compare to, so our plus minus was 0. But if he misses the second practice, we've got 0 and 0 because this formula says O16 minus J16. O16 minus J16. Yes, he doesn't have an average there, but he has an average at F16. What we'd like our formula to do then is to automatically compare it to the previous session when possible. In this case, we'd like to compare the plus minus for the average of the third session right here all the way to the first session. To do this, we're going to add in an additional if error messages to our formula. Bear with me. So we're going to add into our formula right before the 0. Instead of it going to be a reply message for an error to say 0. Instead, we're going to ask it to check another if error. Open the bracket, and I'm going to check the third one minus my first average. If that's an error, it's going to return 0. Now I just have to double check my brackets. I've got 1, 2 on the opening and 1 closing. I'm going to add 1 closing, hit enter, and I have a score of minus 5.5. 2 minutes taken away from 154.5, the difference is negative 5.5. Our formula has worked. If we look at it, if error, so if there's an error subtracting O and J, then rather than it returning 0 right away, then instead it's going to check our message here, O minus F. If that's still an error because he's missed the first 2 practices, it's going to return a 0. Otherwise, it will do that subtraction. So I'm going to drag that formula across with each one. I'm going to apply again that formula to this one because I'd like to compare the fourth average, skipping the third, and compare it to the second. And in my last scenario, I'd like to check it from the fourth practice. Brian missed the 2 middle ones, so it's going to compare the fourth practice to the first practice. I'm going to count my closing brackets. I should have 3 open, so I should have 1, 2, 3 closing. Hit enter, drag the formula down. Here I've got a difference of 6 seconds from the first practice and the fourth practice. That's correct. That gives me my total of just 6 seconds. And I'm going to drag it to the top as well. Now each of my formulas is fixed. So if Justin were to miss multiple practices, his information is still safe and it doesn't show any error messages. We can even type in the reason where he was. He was injured here, sick here, and it doesn't affect any of our numbers. There we have it. Here's our formulas for each column to help us out. Thanks for watching.